September 18th, 1942. Henschel and Sohn Factory. Kassel, Germany. The furnace roared like a beast waking from centuries of sleep, and in that heat, something was being born that would rewrite the rules of war. If you've ever wondered how metal becomes fear, stay close. Because what happened in that factory didn't just build a tank. It built a legend that even the men who created it couldn't control. The blueprints called it the Panzerkampfwagen Vi, but history would remember it by a simpler name, Tiger, and the moment the first prototype rolled out of those factory doors, every engineer in that room knew they had crossed a line between ambition and obsession. The air inside Henschel smelled like molten iron and sweat. The kind of sweat that comes from men who haven't slept in 3 days because the Führer himself demanded results, not excuses. The walls were lined with diagrams that looked more like architectural plans for cathedrals than machines of war, measurements so precise. They required tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters, and yet the designers knew deep in their bones that precision would be both their masterpiece and their curse. This wasn't just about building a tank. It was about proving that German engineering could achieve what the rest of the world said was impossible. A machine so heavy it would crush bridges, so armored it would laugh at enemy shells, and so powerful it would redefine what terror looked like on a battlefield. But here's the part no one talks about. The Tiger was never supposed to exist. Not because the Allies didn't want it, but because Germany's own generals thought it was a fantasy, a death trap wrapped in steel, too expensive, too slow, too complicated to ever work in real combat. And they were right, except for one thing, it worked anyway. The story begins not in 1942, but in 1937, when a young engineer named Erwin Aders sat in a Berlin office staring at a problem no one had solved. How do you make a tank that can survive a direct hit from a Soviet anti-tank gun at point-blank range? The answer, according to every military doctrine at the time, was you don't. You make tanks fast. You make them cheap. You make them expendable. But Aders didn't think like a soldier. He thought like an architect. And architects don't design buildings to fall. They design them to stand for centuries. So he started sketching not a tank, but a fortress on tracks. Armor so thick it would require an entirely new type of steel. A gun so large it would need its own suspension system. And an engine powerful enough to move what was essentially a rolling bunker weighing over 50 tons. His colleagues laughed. His superiors dismissed him. But Aders kept drawing, because in his mind, he wasn't designing a weapon, he was designing a statement that Germany could build what no other nation dared to imagine. The year was 1937, and the world was still pretending that the First World War had been the war to end all wars. But Aders knew better. He had served in the trenches, had seen men drown in mud while artillery turned the earth into a moonscape, and he understood that the next war wouldn't be won by men. It would be won by machines, and whoever built the best machine would write the future in blood and steel. Aders worked in obscurity for 3 years, refining his designs in a small office with a single window that overlooked the Spree River, and every morning he would arrive before dawn and leave after midnight, surviving on coffee and cigarettes in the belief that he was building something that mattered. His notebooks, which still exist in German military archives, are filled with calculations so dense they look like ancient mathematics, stress tests for armor plating, trajectory analysis for shell deflection, thermodynamics for engine cooling, every page a testament to a mind that refused to accept the word impossible. But by 1940, his designs were still gathering dust because the Blitzkrieg was working. German Panzer IIEs and IVS were tearing through France and Poland with such ease that the High Command saw no reason to invest in a heavier tank. Speed and surprise were winning battles, and Aders' fortress on tracks seemed like a solution to a problem that didn't exist yet. That changed in June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa launched and German tanks rolled into the Soviet Union expecting another quick victory, but instead they met the T-34. A Soviet medium tank that was faster, better armored, and more reliable than anything Germany had fielded. And suddenly, Aders' drawings didn't look so crazy anymore. The T-34 was a revelation and a nightmare. It had sloped armor that deflected German shells, wide tracks that let it move through mud and snow without getting stuck, and a 76 mm gun that could kill a Panzer III from a kilometer away. German tank crews started refusing to engage Soviet armor unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority and casualty. Reports from the Eastern Front began to read like horror stories. Entire battalions wiped out in hours. Commanders begging for reinforcements, for air support, for anything that could stop the Soviet steel tide. Hitler read these reports with growing fury because the narrative of German superiority was crumbling in the frozen forests of Russia, and he needed something, anything, to restore faith in the Wehrmacht's invincibility. That's when someone remembered Erwin Aders and his impossible tank, and in November 1941, he was summoned to a meeting in Berlin where he found himself standing in front of Albert Speer, Fritz Todt, and a room full of generals who looked at him like he was their last hope. They gave him 6 months to build a working prototype, unlimited funding, and a single demand: make it unstoppable. Aders returned to Henschel with a blank check and a mandate from the highest levels of the Reich, and he assembled a team of the best engineers Germany had, men who had designed locomotives, aircraft engines, naval artillery, and together they began the most ambitious tank project in history. The first challenge was the armor. Existing German tanks used homogeneous steel plating that was effective but limited. So Aders proposed something radical: face-hardened armor with a soft inner core and a hardened outer shell, making it incredibly resistant to penetration while remaining light enough to be mobile, or at least mobile by the standards of a 57-ton vehicle. The second challenge was the gun. Aders wanted the 88mm flat gun, the same weapon that had terrorized Allied bombers over Germany. But mounting an anti-aircraft gun on a tank presented enormous engineering problems. The recoil alone could flip a lighter vehicle. So they had to design an entirely new turret with hydraulic stabilization and a reinforced mounting system that could absorb the shock of firing a shell capable of traveling over a kilometer per second. The third challenge, and perhaps the most difficult, was the engine. Because moving 57 tons requires power that most engines of the era simply couldn't produce without overheating, breaking down, or consuming fuel at rates that made the tank operationally useless. The Maybach HL230 was the solution, a V12 engine that produced 700 horsepower, more than twice the output of a standard Panzer IV engine, but it was a temperamental beast, prone to overheating, leaking oil, and requiring constant maintenance. The engineers knew this. They knew the engine was a compromise, but they also knew there was no alternative. No other power plant in Germany could move the Tiger, so they accepted the risk and built cooling systems, filtration systems, redundancy systems, all designed to keep the engine running just long enough to win a battle before it needed to be torn apart and rebuilt. The transmission was another nightmare. A Maybach over gearbox with 8 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, incredibly advanced for its time, but also incredibly fragile. They required a driver with weeks of training just to shift gears without stripping the teeth. And in combat conditions where stress and fear made fine motor control nearly impossible, transmission failures became so common that German tank schools added entire courses just on how to nurse a broken gearbox back to life. By May 1942, the first prototype was ready, and when it rolled out of the Henschel factory, it looked like something from a fever dream: massive, angular, covered in armor plates that overlapped like the scales of a dragon, and mounted with a gun so large it seemed absurd that it could be fired from a mobile platform. The test crew climbed inside, 5 men crammed into a space that smelled like grease and gunpowder, and they drove it to a proving ground outside Kassel, where a row of captured Soviet tanks had been lined up as targets. The order was simple: fire until there's nothing left, and when the Tiger's 88mm gun roared for the first time, the sound was so loud it shattered windows in buildings half a kilometer away, and the shell, moving at 800 meters per second, punched through the front armor of a T-34, exited through the rear, and kept going until it buried itself in a hillside 200 meters beyond. The engineers watching didn't cheer. They just stood in silence, because they realized they had built something that wasn't a tank, it was an execution machine, and the implications of that were too heavy to celebrate. The Tiger entered production in August 1942, And from the very beginning, it was a logistical catastrophe. Each tank required over 300,000 man-hours to build, used materials that were in desperately short supply, and cost 250,000 Reichsmarks, enough to build 5 Panzer IVs or equip an entire infantry battalion. Germany's economy was already straining under the weight of a two-front war. Factories were being bombed by the Allies. Raw materials were running out, and yet Hitler insisted that Tiger production continue, not because it was strategically sound, but because he believed, genuinely believed, that a single Tiger was worth 10 Allied tanks, and in his mind, quality would always triumph over quantity. This belief, this faith in engineering excellence as a substitute for industrial capacity, would become one of the defining delusions of the Third Reich, and the Tiger was its most expensive monument. The first Tigers were deployed in late August 1942 near Leningrad, and the unit chosen to field them was the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, an elite formation handpicked for their experience and skill. The crews underwent months of training just to learn how to operate the Tiger, because unlike the Panzer 304, which could be driven by anyone with basic mechanical knowledge, the Tiger demanded expertise. The driver had to understand gear ratios and torque curves. The gunner had to calculate range and trajectory with precision that bordered on scientific, and the commander had to manage fuel consumption, ammunition reserves, and mechanical status while also directing the battle. These weren't just tank crews, they were specialists, and losing even one trained Tiger crew was a blow Germany couldn't afford. On August 29, 1942, the 502nd encountered Soviet armor near the village of Mega, and the engagement that followed would become the first chapter in the Tiger's legend. 4 Tigers faced off against 12 T-34s in a combat scenario that should have been a bloodbath. Soviet doctrine emphasized speed and numbers. Their tanks would swarm German positions, absorb casualties, and overwhelm through sheer volume of fire. But when the T-34s opened fire at 800 meters, their shells bounced off the Tiger's frontal armor like stones off a castle wall, and the Soviet crews, who had never seen this before, hesitated just for a moment. But in tank warfare, a moment is a lifetime. The Tigers returned fire, and in less than 6 minutes, all 12 T-34s were burning, their crews either dead or fleeing, and the Tigers didn't have a single scratch. The Soviet commander who witnessed the engagement sent a report back to Moscow that read like a ghost story. He described the Tigers as indestructible, said their armor was impervious to Soviet guns, and recommended that all units avoid engagement unless they had 5-1 numerical superiority and air support. And that report, circulated through the Red Army, did more damage than the Tigers themselves ever could, because it created a psychological barrier, a belief that fighting a Tiger was suicide. But the reality was more complicated, because while the Tiger could dominate in open combat, it was also breaking down constantly. The interleaved road wheels, those overlapping steel discs that gave the Tiger its iconic profile, were a maintenance nightmare. Mud and snow would pack between them, freeze overnight, and lock the entire suspension system, forcing crews to spend hours in sub-zero temperatures chipping ice with hammers and crowbars just to get the tank moving again. In the Russian winter, where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, Tigers would seize up completely, their engines refusing to start, their transmissions freezing solid, and entire battalions would be stranded not because they were destroyed in combat, but because the cold turned them into 57-ton paperweights. The Tiger's fuel consumption was another crippling weakness. It could travel 120 kilometers on a full tank under ideal conditions. But in combat, with constant maneuvering, acceleration, and the engine running at high RPMs, that range dropped to 60 kilometers, sometimes less. And refueling a Tiger in the field required specialized fuel trucks that were themselves high-value targets. So German units would often abandon Tigers not because they were damaged, but because they ran out of fuel and there was no way to resupply them. There are documented cases from the Eastern Front where Tigers were found intact, fully operational, with ammunition still in the racks, sitting abandoned in fields because the crew walked away when the fuel gauge hit zero and the nearest supply depot was 200 kilometers behind enemy lines. And yet, despite all of these flaws, the Tiger's reputation grew because every time one appeared on a battlefield, it created chaos. Allied intelligence reports from 1943 are filled with sightings of Tigers that didn't exist. Tank crews would see a Panzer IV at a distance, assume it was a Tiger, and call in artillery strikes. Entire offensives would be delayed because commanders believed they were facing Tiger battalions, when in reality there were only 2 or 3 Tigers in the entire sector. The Tiger had become a phantom, a psychological weapon that didn't need to be present to be effective, and the German High Command, recognizing this, began to deploy Tigers not for their combat effectiveness but for their propaganda value. They would send a single Tiger to support an infantry attack, not because it was needed, but because the mere presence of a Tiger would boost German morale and shatter enemy resolve. By 1943, the Tiger had become a symbol of the Third Reich's technological superiority, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the planning for Operation Citadel. The Battle of Kursk, which Hitler envisioned as the decisive blow that would cripple the Soviet Union and turn the tide of the war. The plan was simple: concentrate hundreds of Tigers and their newer cousin, the Panther, into 2 massive armored spearheads, smash through Soviet defenses, encircle their forces, and annihilate them in a single grand offensive. On paper, it was brilliant. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen because the Soviets knew it was coming. They had spent months fortifying the Kursk salient with minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery positions, and most critically, they had developed new tactics specifically designed to counter the Tiger. The Battle of Kursk began on July 5, 1943, and within hours the flaws in the Tiger's design became catastrophically apparent. The minefields shredded the interleaved road wheels, immobilizing Tigers before they even made contact with Soviet armor. The anti-tank ditches were too wide for the Tigers to cross, forcing them to bunch up in kill zones where Soviet artillery and anti-tank guns could fire at their thinner side armor, and the sheer number of Soviet tanks, over 5,000 deployed in the salient, meant that even when Tigers destroyed enemy armor, there were always more coming. Waves of T-34s that absorbed casualties and kept pushing forward, trading 10 tanks for 1 Tiger, and still coming out ahead because the Soviets could replace their losses and Germany couldn't. On July 12th, near the village of Prokhorovka, the largest tank battle in history took place, and it was here that the Tiger's myth began to crack. German forces, including elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps equipped with Tigers, faced off against the Soviet 5th Guards tank army in a sprawling engagement that involved over 1,500 tanks fighting across a battlefield, so chaotic that commanders on both sides lost track of their own units. The Tigers fought brilliantly, destroying Soviet tanks at ranges where return fire was impossible, but they couldn't be everywhere at once, and the Soviets, learning from earlier engagements, stopped trying to fight the Tigers head-on. Instead, they targeted the supply trucks, the repair vehicles, the fuel depots, and one by one, the Tigers began to run out of ammunition, run out of fuel, run out of spare parts. And when a Tiger broke down in the middle of a battlefield with no way to repair it and no way to recover it, the crew had one option: set demolition charges, blow the turret off, and retreat on foot, leaving behind a machine that cost $250,000 Reichsmarks to become scrap metal for the Soviets to study. By the end of Kursk, Germany had lost over 200 tanks, including dozens of Tigers, and while they had inflicted far heavier losses on the Soviets, the strategic result was clear. Germany could no longer afford offensive operations on this scale. The Tiger, despite its fearsome reputation, couldn't change the fundamental math of the war. Germany was outnumbered, outproduced, and running out of time. But the Tiger kept being built, kept being deployed, because stopping production would have been an admission of failure, and the Third Reich was not in the business of admitting failure. So the factories kept running, the engineers kept refining, and the Tigers kept rolling out, fewer and fewer each month as Allied bombing raids turned Kassel into rubble and supply lines collapsed under the weight of a crumbling empire. In 1944, the Tiger underwent a major redesign. The result was the Tiger II, also known as the King Tiger or Königstiger, and if the original Tiger was an Exercise in excess, the King Tiger was a monument to madness. It weighed 70 tons, had armor up to 180 millimeters thick, and mounted a longer, more powerful 88 millimeters gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. It was also slower, more expensive, and even more prone to mechanical failure than its predecessor. And by the time it entered service in late 1944, Germany was losing on every front. The Eastern Front was collapsing. The Western Front was being pushed back toward the Rhine, and the factories that built the King Tiger were being bombed into oblivion. Only 489 King Tigers were ever produced, compared to over 50,000 Soviet T-34s and nearly 50,000 American Shermans. And while each King Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, they were also irrelevant because wars aren't won by masterpieces. They're won by logistics, and Germany's logistics were gone. There's a photograph taken in the Ardennes forest in December 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge of a King Tiger abandoned on the side of a road, its tracks missing, its turret frozen in place, and next to it, a handwritten sign left by the crew that reads, "No fuel, no ammo, no hope." And that photograph captures the entire tragedy of the Tiger program. Because here was the most powerful tank ever built at that point in history, sitting useless in the snow, not because it was defeated in battle, but because the infrastructure needed to keep it running had ceased to exist. The crews who operated Tigers in the final months of the war were often teenagers, boys pulled from the Hitler Youth and given 2 weeks of training before being sent to the front. And they would climb into these machines that their fathers and older brothers had once operated with pride. And they would drive them until they ran out of fuel, and then they would walk home if they were lucky, or they would be captured. Or they would die, and the Tigers would sit there, rusting monuments to a war that was already lost. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered, and the Tiger production line was destroyed, the factories were bombed, the engineers were dead or scattered, and the few remaining Tigers were captured by the Allies and Soviets, who studied them with a mixture of awe and confusion, awe at the craftsmanship, confusion at the wastefulness, because to an American or Soviet engineer, the Tiger made no sense. It was over-engineered, over-complicated, and over-expensive, a tank designed by people who valued perfection over practicality, and in the cold calculus of industrial warfare, that was a fatal flaw. But the Tiger's story didn't end in 1945 because the tanks themselves might have been destroyed. But the legend lived on, and in the decades after the war, the Tiger became a cultural icon, a symbol of German engineering prowess, of technological superiority, and of the fine line between genius and hubris. Allied veterans returning home told stories about the Tiger, and with each retelling, the stories grew, the armor got thicker, the gun got bigger, the invincibility became absolute, and soon the Tiger existed in two forms: the historical machine, flawed and finite, and the mythological monster, unstoppable and eternal. Hollywood made movies about tigers, model companies produced kits, historians wrote books, and the Tiger became the most famous tank in history, despite being one of the least produced and least effective strategically, because effectiveness and fame are not the same thing. And the Tiger's fame came not from what it accomplished, but from what it represented, the idea that excellence, taken to its extreme, could overcome any obstacle, and the tragedy that sometimes excellence isn't enough. Modern historians still debate whether the Tiger was worth it, whether Germany should have built 1,300 Tigers or 6,500 Panzer IVs. Whether the resources spent on the Tiger could have been better used on aircraft or submarines or literally anything else, and the answer, depending on who you ask, ranges from absolutely not to it doesn't matter because Germany was going to lose anyway. But what's not debatable is the impact the Tiger had on the men who faced it. Because those men, Allied tankers who saw Tigers on the battlefield, carried that fear for the rest of their lives. And when they were interviewed in their 70s and 80s, they still remembered the moment a Tiger appeared, the sound of its engine, the shape of its silhouette, and the sinking feeling that they were about to die. That fear, that visceral, unforgettable terror, is the Tiger's true legacy, not the number of tanks it destroyed, not the battles it won or lost, but the psychological scar it left on a generation of soldiers who learned that sometimes the enemy builds something so monstrous that the only rational response is fear. The engineers who built the Tiger knew this, or at least some of them did, because in interviews conducted after the war, men like Ferdinand Porsche, who designed competing prototypes, and Erwin Aders, who didn't live to see the war's end, their colleagues spoke about the project with a strange mixture of pride and regret. Pride that they had achieved something technically remarkable, regret that their masterpiece had been used for such destruction, and the understanding, unspoken but present, that they had built a weapon that was too good at killing and not good enough at winning. There's a quote from a Henschel engineer, his name lost to history, who said after the war, "We built the Tiger to end the war. Instead, it prolonged our suffering, because every Tiger we built convinced us we could still win, and that belief, that refusal to accept reality, cost us everything. If you've stayed with this story, if you followed the Tiger from the drawing board in 1937 to the scrapyard in 1945, then you understand what Armored Foundry is about. We don't just tell you that a tank was built, we show you why it mattered, how it was made, what it cost, and what it meant to the people who built it, fought in it, and died trying to stop it. The Tiger is not just a machine, it's a monument to human ambition, to the belief that if you make something perfect enough, strong enough, powerful enough, you can bend reality to your will, and the hard truth that reality doesn't bend, it breaks. And when it breaks, it takes everything with it. The Tiger terrified the world not because it was invincible, but because it was close enough to make us ask, what if Germany had the fuel, the factories, the time, the sanity to build 1,000 Tigers instead of 1,300? What if the war had lasted another year? What if the engineers had been left alone to perfect their creation without interference from politicians and madmen? And the answer is, it wouldn't have mattered. Because the Tiger's greatest weakness wasn't its transmission or its fuel consumption or its weight, it was the regime that built it. A regime that valued spectacle over strategy, perfection over pragmatism, and myth over reality. The last Tiger rolled off the production line in August 1944, and by then Kassel was a ruin, the factory was a crater, and the men who had built the first prototypes were either dead or in hiding, and the Tiger itself had become a relic, a machine from another era, an era where Germany still believed it could win, where engineering excellence was seen as a substitute for industrial capacity, and where a single tank could change the course of history. That era ended not with a bang, but with the quiet clicking of an empty fuel gauge, the grinding of a seized transmission, and the silence of a crew abandoning their vehicle in a forest somewhere in France or Poland or Russia, leaving behind the most feared tank in the world to rust in peace, a tomb of steel for a dream that died with the regime that forged it. If this story changed how you see machines, how you see war, how you see the distance between what we build and what we believe, then you're already part of what we're building here at Armored Foundry. And the next time you see a Tiger in a museum, you'll see it differently, not as a relic, but as a warning that the best tools in the wrong hands are just expensive ways to lose. And that history remembers not who built the best machine, but who used their machines wisely. The forge is always burning, and the next story is already being cast, because the machines we build define us, and the Tiger defined an entire generation, not because it won, but because it showed us what happens when genius serves madness, when perfection becomes obsession, and when the pursuit of the impossible costs everything and delivers nothing but a legend written in fire and steel, and the screams of men who died believing in a machine that couldn't save them. If you're still here, then you know what comes next. The archive is open. The next file is waiting. And when you're ready, we'll forge the next chapter together, because history isn't written. It's built one rivet at a time, one story at a time. And the Tiger's story is just the beginning of what happens when humanity tries to engineer its way out of the wars it starts.